It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
All right, good afternoon. Ed Sterling again on the fourth of 4 lectures that are generally involving the railroad that went through Berlin, the Central Mass Railroad. We'll hit on a couple of slides you may have seen before, just talking about the railroad history, but the theme today are the ammo bunkers, the mysterious ammunition bunkers that were placed in Sudbury and Maynard and Stowe in World War II. And our guest speaker assistant is Jan Wright, who is one of the principals. She's the Evie Dueck of the Friends of the Assabet River Wildlife Refuge over in Sudbury, who is responsible for bringing much of the history of that complex to our attention, and that's who I learned from myself. Yeah, pretty amazing, huh? So Jan will be our expert if we need it. Okay. So again, our theme is the Massachusetts Central or Central Massachusetts Railroad, and a lot of artillery shells there that look as if they're a bit worse for wear. All right, and that's the story behind how this complex got created. All right. So just a quick history again of the railroad that was the Central Mass up here. Again, an underfunded railroad from the start. Didn't make a lot of sense that it was needed to be built, but they built it. There really was very little industry that was going to be helped by this railroad, and yet there was railroad fever, as they called it. Everybody wanted the railroad because that's how your town could prosper. There weren't automobiles yet, and this started in 1881 from Boston to Northampton. Okay. The Depression hit many of these railroads very hard. A lot of smaller branch lines closed. Passenger service in many cases disappeared, both from the economics of the Depression and the impact of the automobile, which came on very strong, probably stronger than people even realized. Okay. So the railroad, though, did help the war effort in World War II. Even though it was hit hard in the Depression, thank God we had our railroads in this country, because it was essential for moving material and troops from coast to coast, fighting two wars on two theaters, if you will. Okay. Everything was steam up to the end of the war. A little bit of steam lasted into the mid-50s, disappeared very quickly as diesel technology came on strong. It was far more efficient, much cheaper in many cases than running old steam locomotives, which required a lot of manpower and maintenance. So the diesels took over, but yet airlines now suddenly came to prominence. We had all these pilots who had flown 4-engine bombers in World War II and fighter pilots, and they made wonderful commercial pilots after the war. And so airplane technology and the available manpower gave the airline industry a huge boost. Okay. Freight service today is doing quite well nationally. Passenger service is limited to Amtrak, and I track Amtrak a little bit, and it's often very late, and it's fairly expensive, sadly. So this is a map of the system of the Central Mass Railroad going from Boston all the way out to Northampton. And it hit all these little tiny towns. And one of the sad things, as I say, is it really never hit any good industrial centers to make economic sense. It really was more of a passenger railroad, I would argue. But again, it ended up being a losing business. And it seemed that there was relatively little freight that it carried in the end. And so it was kind of a sad little railroad that was hit by the hurricane of 1938, which cut it in half. And for short money, bridges were not repaired after the hurricane, and the western end out to Northampton was left to wither and die, and the eastern end here pretty much ended in Clinton to Boston. And so the hurricane of 38 was quite a big deal for the life of this railroad. Okay. It became a division of the famous big Boston and Maine. It survived as its own company until about 1900. The Boston and Maine was probably the premier railroad in New England. Boston and Maine bought all the shares, and it became what they call a division. Today's commuter line that goes up through Acton and Fitchburg is known as the Fitchburg Division, and that was once its own railroad, the Fitchburg Railroad. So these were all absorbed by the Boston and Maine over time. Right? And there's a wonderful book that got me started on this. It used to be a very difficult book to find. This is only $20, and that's probably overpriced because it was reprinted in 2008 with all kinds of extra photos and so on. So I just brought it along as a sample, but this is a great reference book, and it has a fair amount of detail of what went on at the ammunition bunkers too. So for my other presentation, I say let's take a ride on the railroad. So let's just get a general idea. The railroad basically shared common tracks in the city and then became its own entity as it goes through Waltham, all right? And never hit any decent business locations that made any sense. It went over 128, and the bridge is still there when you're on 128. And whether it's going to be used as a rail trail again, I don't know, but why not, right? Why waste all that good steel? Right? That's one of the old Budd cars. We talked about the self-propelled cars. This would probably be like, 1956, passing over the Fitchburg Railroad, the one that we all use for the MBTA to get out to South Acton and Littleton and so on. And so it's going to enter Weston. Isn't that cute? Look at the little buggy at the station, 1915, so that's a pretty early car. And that poor station sadly is kind of falling apart right now. I wrote to the Weston Historical Society, and they say they're trying to do something to save it, but it's almost beyond help at this point. The rail trail is beautiful at this point. It's all been installed. It's all paved. Goes right under the bridge at Church Street and goes up through Wayland. Right? And there's cute little Wayland with the horse and buggy and nice freight train. And the station itself is still there. It's just beautifully restored as sort of a kind of an artist shop right there on Route 27 at 20. Beautiful little station to see. Okay. So the train would continue to South Sudbury, where the railroad from Concord comes down to Framingham and crosses over at what they call the Diamond. All right. We talked about those old self-propelled cars before, the silver ones, called Doodlebugs, and that's a Doodlebug coming from Clinton. And there it is in the sad ending days, no station anymore, but a little shack. And that was the end of the line. Okay. So we're getting closer to the ammo bunkers, and the one station we are alerted to is the Wayside Inn. And although the Wayside Inn was about 1.5 miles down, they had a little station for it, for the prominent guests that would stop by. Henry Ford, Babe Ruth would have been there. Henry Ford bought it for a while. Right? And they had a little what they call flag stop. You could wave the train down. And that cute little station was where the guests would come. They'd wait for the wagon with the horse and buggy to come up the old dirt road and wait for the train to come. All right. So the Y to the bunkers, Y being essentially a way of describing the letter Y, but the tracks come together like a Y to help an old steam locomotive turn around, because they don't turn around easily. All right. So World War II came along, and one of the problems they had was ammunition and storage of ammunition. And so they had some terrible examples in World War I and between the wars of ammunition depots blowing up. Right? And they worried, could German battleships, which never appeared, but German U-boats certainly appeared, and could U-boats come in the Boston Harbor and maybe blow up a Liberty ship? Okay. So one of the lessons learned was the horror of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There was a collision of 2 ships in Halifax Harbor. One of them was carrying a lot of munitions, and they somehow collided, and there was a fire, and the fire resulted in the munitions blowing up, and a huge part of the Halifax city was leveled. And Boston came to the rescue to help the people, the injured, and so on. And I believe to this day, Halifax gives Boston a Christmas tree in thanks for that rescue effort. Okay? But the damage was just terrible. So this was one of the ships, obviously, in the harbor. It's a wonder that even is not in pieces. Pictures of the explosion could be seen for many, many miles. And there's the devastation. I mean, just like a nuclear bomb almost. It was terrible. So with that in mind, they thought they had some idea of how to store munitions properly. And it turned out they didn't do it right. So there was an arsenal in New Jersey called Picatinny. And within the Picatinny arsenal area was a smaller sub-area called Lake Denmark. And that was where many of the munitions were actually stored. What they thought was in bunkers, in safe bunkers. And in July of 1926, there was a huge thunderstorm. And lightning hit one of the bunkers. And it blew up. And then it kept blowing up and blowing up and blowing up. For 3 days, apparently, it just kept blowing up. Bunker after bunker ignited. Of the 317 acres, a tremendous amount of the area was blown up. 187 buildings were flattened out of 200 total. 90% plus devastation. Millions of pounds of explosives blown up. At the time, 47 million in losses, calculated to be over $600 million in today's money in terms of the value and the damage. Horrible. So apparently Congress said, we got to figure this out in a better way, and they created an explosives safety board to try to stop these explosions that were obviously costly and deadly for 21 people losing their lives. Right. These are just some pictures of the disaster. I mean, you can see it's just as if a nuclear bomb had gone off. Right. I assume those didn't have anything in them. So, World War II comes, and now they really have to face the problem again. What are we going to do with munitions that we're creating all around the country? We're trying to support the war in Europe. They're going to come to a harbor, in this case in Boston. And what if a German submarine comes into the harbor and blows up a Liberty ship? There's got to be some better way than storing them at the harbor itself, waiting for a convoy to go across the ocean. So they came out to Sudbury and Stowe and Maynard, and they looked at a map, and they had relatively few people in that area. The real bonus was they had the Central Massachusetts Railroad, okay, coming from Boston, which was a huge plus. They didn't really have to construct very much at all, okay, because the railroad was available, and it was in good shape at that time. All right. 25 miles away from Boston, so safe from even a battleship's shell, most people would argue, and it had the railroad. And so the poor old Central Mass Railroad that didn't seem to have much of a purpose suddenly came to life as being very valuable for the war effort. All right. So this area was rural. It had mostly farms. There really wasn't much of a populace to have to relocate or perhaps object to their plans. And so in March of 1942, the word was going around that there was some secret project going on in that area. And lo and behold, a month later, the notices start to be tacked on people's door. And it would say, you have to get off your property in 10 days. And people were paid, in some cases, they say, 10 cents on the dollar. And so, again, they got a notice tacked to the door, and that's the end of your farm. And there's no objections. The government is coming in, they're going to level the farms, and they're going to create this special ammunition bunker area in that 2,500 acres. Sorry, let's see. They called it a government mystery project. That's what some of the residents said, with the rumor going around. Be out in 1 week to 10 days. So they created igloos, and that was the actual word that they used. It was a special bunker, concrete. They mounded dirt on top of it. Right? It had steel doors in front, and they built 50 of them. Jan, did they go to 55? Are there some oddballs? 50 seems to be the number that I've heard. And so these were the dimensions: 81 feet long, 26 wide, 12 feet tall. And they were essentially camouflaged, if you will, with all the dirt on top of them. So thick enough dirt to protect them again from lightning strikes. And then they even put lightning arresters, so they had like telephone poles on the ends with a lightning wire to get the lightning to attract to the wire and then ground that to try to keep any attraction of the lightning away from the actual bunker itself and the steel doors. Okay? So this is a picture of one of them. All right? And in front you can see a platform, and in those days the railroad track went right to the platform, and it was a perfect fit. You opened up the boxcar door, and if you had your cart full of bullets or ammunition on your dolly cart, you could just wheel it right off with the door open, obviously, and place it inside the bunker as appropriate. Right? So very well designed. And they were all designed in a loop, and I'll show you that in a moment. All right? And again, the strange word igloo. Here's another view of one just slightly from the side. Big steel door to lock it up. And there we are in the winter. Okay. So they were going to build 50 of these, and then the deal was, how do you get the ammunition out there? So they had the Central Mass Railroad. It was a long stretch in the woods at that point. There were no houses around at all, aside from the poor farmers who were kicked out. And in the Y, the locomotive came in from Boston, and it went up one stem of the Y. It discharged all the freight, and they switched, and then they went back the other stem of the Y, and now the locomotive could go back to Boston instead of backing up for 25 miles. It's a big problem with the steam locomotive. Either that or you have a turntable, which are rather expensive to build. So that's what the Y comes from, all right? The locomotive would come in, and they built a rail yard about 8 rails wide. And again, that's where all the different boxcars were stored, and then they would sort out the different kinds of ammunition: rifle bullets, explosives, mines, big artillery shells, and so on. Okay. This is apparently a verified picture of one of the heavy locomotives. In fact, there's 2 of them going through Belmont. One of these special freights that you would not normally have seen on the Central Mass Railroad. There's some oil tankers behind, and that they did need oil for the diesel engines that they used in the complex. So if you think about it, you wouldn't want a locomotive with its belching cinders and hot coals with an ammunition depot. So at that point, there were early diesels, and they had a nice little diesel electric locomotive that was able to carry the cars around the complex very safely without any danger of fire. So that was taken in Belmont. Okay. This is a slide that comes from the website of Jan's Visitor Center, and it just shows a little better in color all those bunkers and how they got arranged in a circle, each one with an available railroad track right in front of it, so you could discharge the ammunition on that platform. Right.
Were they spaced to be able to discharge more than one car without uncoupling?
My understanding is, yeah, they certainly could have had 2 cars. There was no limitation there, but each bunker again would have just the one platform.
Right,
and
just pull the train in.
Exactly. So little locomotive would come in. Yep. And no, I assume probably one boxcar per run, probably specific. Goes up there, discharges the cargo, goes back to the rail yard to find out what the next assignment is. Okay. And so it's a little strange here. You can see the arrow in the upper right corner pointing north. So you have to orient yourself at 90 degrees. But the railroad is coming in on a straight line, the diagonal line on the right side. There's the Y, the scoop that goes up that way, comes back down, and goes back to Boston. The rail yard is the thick black line in the middle and had about 8 tracks. It crossed the road that we all know today by the Stowe Fire Academy, if you've been down that way, and then enters the complex, and again would switch to the different bunkers on this loop, round and round, returning back, going back to the rail yard to find its next assignment for the particular type of ammunition that they were storing. That's just a close-up of the Y. Virtually everything is gone at this point except the railroad track of the main line. Everything but one rail seems to have been left. And Jan pointed that out to me. I don't know if they got lazy or what, but there's a rail that kind of almost goes underneath a tree. It's the only one that anybody can find. But it was an ingenious idea just to allow the locomotive to come in and back out and then shoot back to Boston. So the rail yard allowed them to sort out the different cars and then get the proper type of car to go up to the main gate, which is where the Sudbury Road is today, and go into the complex. So that pathway, if you will, is the entrance to the current visitor center. And there's kind of a good overview showing all the different bunkers, again, spaced properly enough that if one did blow up, supposedly by scientific calculation, it would not cause the other ones to blow up. I don't know how you test something like that. But hopefully science came to the rescue to understand that it wouldn't hurt the other bunkers if something ever happened. You know, so like an artillery shell could drop and maybe it would explode. So this cute little engine saved the day in that you didn't have to have a steam engine with an active fire and smoke going into a complex. And so that little engine consumed the oil that we saw in the oil cars on that train, and that hauled everything around. They didn't need much power. Again, you probably have 1 or 2 boxcars at a time to go around the complex. And Jan is responsible for cleaning out one of these poor, dirty bunkers. There's probably a story there you might want to tell a few minutes of cleaning it out so that we visitors can come and see what actually was happening inside. So they open up the big locked door and you can go in and see it. And I think you could eat off the floor. It's a beautiful, beautiful cleanup job. Right. And there you are inside. I know it's a little dark, but you can see the sort of arched, almost look like tiles where everything was stored. Right. Okay. So at this point, that's really the story of the ammo bunkers. They didn't go away after the war. If we were on our imaginary train, we would have passed the ammo bunkers at some point. We'd gone on to Ordway, which is in a little shed stop on Parmenter Road in Hudson. We'd pass Gleasondale. And there were 2 stations, one for the train from Concord and one for the Central Mass. This is where the rail trail is today in Hudson. And we end up in Hudson, and that's kind of just about the end of our journey. And there's the Berlin station by Mrs. Porter's house that sadly is gone, but Mrs. Porter's house still survives. And there's all kinds of tracks in the wood at this point. Could we rebuild the station? Would be nice.
That telegraph pole and stuff is still there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So after the war, it was still a military installation. I remember when I first moved here in '87, there was a wonderful playground down in Sudbury, and you could take the back road in Hudson, 62 branched off north, and you just continue on what would be Hudson Main Street, and then it turned into the Sudbury Road. The state built the big fire academy, and the very next entrance is the wildlife refuge that it became. So Fort Devens, it was called the Fort Devens Annex. And there was literally a guard in military uniform. I remember a gate, there was a light, and it was like no entrance. Had to be special business related to the military. When Devens closed in 95, 96 timeframe, that facility was really part of the same closure, and it was given to Fish and Wildlife. As much of Fort Devens south of Route 2 was given. So Devens retained some of the military training area along Route 70, but hundreds of acres were given to Fish and Wildlife in what's known as the Oxbow Wildlife Refuge. Okay? And so this became the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. And unfortunately, an EPA super site, because of all the different chemicals that were used in the 1950s and 60s and so on. But it's been, I believe, cleaned up satisfactorily, and all the railroads are gone. So as I say, aside from that one rail that seems to be lost in the woods, you really wouldn't know it. So many of the rail tracks and so on, if you will, turned into hiking paths and biking paths through the woods. And that's how they live on today. The bunkers, again, they're not going to be removed. They're just silent sentinels to something that happened a long time ago. And aside from the one that Jan's friends cleaned up and allowed us to be in, that's really, the mystery remains in the woods as to what happened. And there's the last rail, kind of sitting under a tree almost. All right. So this is a republishing of the original book here. Again, this book and the newer version is really the Bible for anyone interested in the railroads in this area. Again, going from Boston all the way out to Northampton. I think it's $40, and it's sold if the gift shop is open, Jan. That book is available at the gift shop at the Wildlife Center. And it's just wonderful. The quality of the pictures and the writing is phenomenal. And so that's it. That's the story of the ammo bunkers, kind of just a remnant of World War II, and in the sad era, if you will, for the farmers that lost their land permanently, was never to be returned, and will stay as a wildlife refuge forever, and with those bunkers just sitting there. Thank you. That's it. Appreciate it. So Jan is here from the National Wildlife Refuge. Are there any comments that you would want to add, Jan?
Well, first of all, one thing that Ed did not mention is that the bunkers are 400 feet apart, because after they decided that the bunkers did their job by imploding instead of exploding, they decided that 400 feet was a good safety measure. And the loops that the tracks used to be on were 1,400 feet a loop, so that the locomotives and the cars would have ample chance to get through the place. I mean, just think, at that point, there were no trees in the place. It was strictly farmland that they were using. And after a while, the trees started growing, and of course the place was closed. So one of the things that people are getting confused about is that all of the trails in there basically were the access roads to the bunkers. And the railroad itself, the right-of-way, where the ties used to be, and there's still a lot of ties in there, are just little tiny right-of-ways right next to each platform. But the road over here that people think is where they were the access roads for employees and trucks. And there's 17 miles of trails in there, or access roads, some of which were and still are original farm roads when the residents were there. And there were about 98 residents, farmers in there when they were told to scram, that word got something real important coming in. So, and
fascinating, isn't it?
If anybody's interested to look at the inside, there were 360 36 by 24 cement blocks held up by rebar and steel. And that arch that he showed you goes all the way down, and it is 81 feet long. And that's why they call it an igloo. There's 360 of these. And there is a vent in the back. And Ed did talk about the lightning arrestor cable system, which Picatinny did not have, which is why that explosions happened so readily because there was nothing out there for them to be shielded. Everything was out in the open. So there's a couple more pictures that I think I'm going to give Ed.
Okay. Well, I just got this one a few hours ago. This is wonderful.
Scanned that to him this morning.
Yes, yes. And apparently that's what you're seeing. The chronology is a little odd because if it went up in March of 42 on your door, I'm not quite sure why it mentions November of 42 almost 6 months later. So I'm not sure if that's some kind of a reprint of a map.
The transfer.
Must have been, okay.
The transfer time.
All right,
Hey, it's the
Oh, I
federal
see.
government. What do you want?
right. Give them time, right? Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? Just a huge eminent domain, 2,500 acres like that. And people were not well compensated, there's no doubt about that. You know, some reports in the paper were that people were happy and they were glad to support the war effort. I would wonder about that. They were probably, couldn't believe it happened, yeah. I happened on the facility one day just by pulling off the road, I think, to check my cell phone, and I wondered where that road went, and I drove down the half a mile of the beautiful access road and came upon the visitor center, which happened to be closed at the time, and there's a kiosk, and it mentioned that Jan was going to give a presentation about the history of the place. And so I called her up quick and said, I hope you have another seat so I can attend your lecture, and that's how I began to learn about it. I had no idea what happened after those guards disappeared when Fort Devens closed. It was just the oddest thing to see Fort Devens in Sudbury, and lo and behold, it really was something of a quiet story. It looked as if the Sudbury Historical Society gave a presentation. I think it was October of 2010. Was on your it was the appendage on your yellow poster. I'm not sure if we can see that. There it is. They called it the black hole. So it was a Sudbury historical presentation in 2010 describing the events that happened there. Did you ever make that one? Did you know about that at the time, that presentation? Or did you give it, in fact?
When the visitor center was dedicated in 2010,
Okay.
the Sudbury Historical Society had a guest speaker.
Ah,
And
okay.
I believe it was George Hill that was there.
Okay.
He was one of the residents of Assabet,
I see.
but it wasn't Assabet at the time, it was just Sudbury.
You bet.
okay, At the time.
Right.
And so they decided to have a resident of the fort, one of the fort towns.
Yes.
Of which it is, make a presentation off of his mother's diary.
Oh my gosh.
And
Wow.
so they made this flyer,
Okay.
and it was
Yeah.
it was a celebration of the opening of the visitor center and the refuge itself.
Okay.
And that's the only one I have.
Wow. What's the status of the visitor center today? Do you know?
I wish I knew.
Okay.
No.
COVID.
Still closed.
Yeah, I
what
think.
is it?
I got an email, I
Oh.
belong with friends, and I got an
Okay.
email, I think just a week and a half ago.
Okay.
In the email, in the website, it said it was still closed.
It is
The
still
visitor
closed.
center.
There is a lot of cleaning that has to go on, and
Hmm.
they need maintenance. And because we've only got 2 maintenance people for 8 refuges, it's really tough.
I
The
see.
volunteers are scrambling to
Yeah.
try to clean everything up, and I'm a coordinator for the outreach committee, and so what we're doing is we try to outreach in front of the doors of the visitor center during the summer, so
Okay.
people still know that we're alive, and we give
Okay.
out stuff, and we try to have little stuff for the kids and whatnot until they decide they're gonna open it.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna have to have greeters at the desk,
Right.
which this is how I started. And all I can tell you is right now it's still closed.
Yeah.
But there is a bathroom outside.
That's true. There is.
We
Yes.
did that.
Yes. There's a nice display in the visitor center once it's open that shows a little model railroad of the locomotives pulling up to a bunker and you can see the platform. Just gives you a sense of what it was like. There's a man in Maynard named Boothroyd. He keeps talking about writing a book about it. I wish he would, but I've interviewed him to get a little more history about what I think he knew about the facility in World War II. Yeah. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.